In our last lecture, we began to look at Winston Churchill through the image of his famous ancestor, John, the Duke of Marlborough. Now, Winston Churchill was greatly influenced by the career of Marlborough, and his attachment to Marlborough is more than ancestral pride. In Marlborough, Churchill saw the fruition of an early period of English liberty, the glorious revolution of 1688, which had established the power of Parliament against the Crown, and Marlborough was a parliamentary general. There was also the deep attachment that Churchill felt for truth, and he was deeply angered at the insults that had been hurled against Marlborough and continued to be hurled against Marlborough. And he wrote his biography of his ancestor in an effort to reverse these false statements. And as we shall see, Winston Churchill himself, throughout his career, would be hounded by false accusations. He would be mistrusted. He would be called a political adventurer, even as John, the Duke of Marlborough, had been called a political adventurer. And there is also the notion of the ingratitude of democracy. Now, Marlborough did not live in an age of democracy, but Parliament tore him down despite all of his services. And so, as we shall see, Winston Churchill, despite all of his services, would be given, in his own terms, the Order of the Boot by the British electorate in July of 1945. John, the Duke of Marlborough, fell from power, but he retained his title, he retained his palace at Blenheim. But his only son died young, and the Marlborough titles would pass down through his daughter, Anne, who married the Earl of Sunderland, Charles the Earl of Sunderland, Charles Spencer. And the Churchill and Spencer names would be linked ever thereafter, Winston, Spencer, Churchill. And in fact, in this fashion, Winston Churchill and the late Princess Diana were related. And the coat of arms that flies over Blenheim Palace has both the Churchill and the Spencer arms in it, the griffin of the Spencers and the lion of the Churchills. Now, the descendants of the Duke of Marlborough did not distinguish themselves, except for gambling, spending a great deal of money. One of them was forced to live just in a couple of rooms of the palaces. That was all he could afford. But Churchill's grandfather began the restoration of the family reputation. He served well in Parliament and was Lord Lieutenant of Ireland. Now, Winston Churchill was never the Duke of Marlborough. His father, Lord Randolph, was the second son of the Duke of Marlborough. And Lord Randolph was, from his earliest days, this is Churchill's father, an impetuous man, made a very bad record at Oxford, and his father was deeply concerned about him. But at the time that Churchill was born, in November the 30th, 1874, Lord Randolph had been elected to Parliament and was beginning to make his mark as a speaker of great brilliance. If Churchill were pure English aristocrat on his father's side, on his mother's side, Winston Churchill was an American, a full-blooded American. His mother was Jeanette Jerome. She was the daughter of a very wealthy New York financier, a self-made man who not only made a lot of money on the stock exchange, owned the New York Times for a period, but was also quite a sporting gentleman and liked to drive up and down the streets of New York in a fine carriage and owned many racehorses and was part owner of a racetrack. And he was one of these Americans of that period who made fortunes, lost them, made them again. He would give a dinner party which ladies would receive diamond bracelets as little favors, and he would spend $70,000 in those days currency giving these kinds of parties. His daughters were raised largely in Europe and spent a lot of time in England with their mother. And it was there on August the 12th of 1873 that Jenny Jerome and her sisters were invited to a party on board a British ship in honor of the Tsar-to-be of Russia and given by the Prince of Wales and Princess of Wales. And so they went, and she was introduced to Randolph Churchill. And later on the invitation, she had written, "Met Randolph." And he was an impetuous wooer as well. He wanted to go out with her the next day, and then the next day, and then on the third day propose marriage. Well, her father thought it was a pretty good idea, but for the Duke of Marlborough, his father, this was the final blow. He's going to marry this American woman, and he writes his son and says, you know, you don't know what kind of trouble you're getting into. I have made some inquiries about this father of hers. He is a sharp trader. He does not have a good reputation. He strikes me as one of these Americans of the most vulgar kind. But Randolph pursued. And so his father said, all right, if he will make, the father of this woman will make a generous monetary settlement. And Jenny's father and the Duke wrote back and forth until they agreed upon what seemed a reasonable settlement. But then, is it going to go to Randolph or is it going to go to the girl? And her father said it must go to her. That's how they do it in Russia. The Duke of Marlborough said, I know, but we're in England and we're going to do it my way. It's going to Randolph. Well, again, they split the difference. And in April 1874, the two were married. The Duke of Marlborough and his wife, the Duchess, did not come to the wedding. This was a very clear snub. But they were back in good feeling with their son and had invited them to Blenheim Palace in November. Now, Jenny was 7 months pregnant. It was thought, I mean, she'd been married in April, it had to be about 7 months, don't you think? And she went out hunting and fell, and then went out on a pony ride over very rough ground, and then, to everybody's amazement, showed up that night at the ball and was dancing away when suddenly she realized she was going to have the baby. And they started to rush her off to her bedroom, but they had to go through the library at Blenheim, which is probably the longest room in all of England. And so she couldn't make it, so they whisked her into a bedroom that was being used as a cloakroom, swept the beds off the floor, and swept the cloaks off the bed, and there she gave birth to young Winston. The first decision I made in life, he said, was to be born at Blenheim. I am most satisfied with that decision, he said. He was always proud of his American heritage. He delighted in the fact that his mother had some Iroquois Indian in her background, and that on her side he had several ancestors who fought in the army of George Washington as officers. So he was born, and at that very moment, his father was beginning his parliamentary career, Lord Randolph, a powerful man, huge swooping mustaches, rather protruding eyes. And he set out to rise very, very fast in the Conservative Party. And he set out to rise by taking on the leadership. He set forth a program of Tory democracy in which he argued for education for the poor, health insurance, Social Security, pension plans, unemployment insurance. But at this very moment, as he was beginning to make his mark in Parliament, his speeches being very rapidly given, very forcefully given, a master of sarcasm, he showed his impetuosity. Well, this is a tangled story, people long dead, but the gist of it is the Marquis of Blandford, now that is to say, Lord Randolph's brother. See, all these English aristocrats have various titles and at various times, and before you get to be the Duke of Marlborough, you're the Marquis of Blandford. And so the Marquis of Blandford was carrying on this affair with the wife of an earl. Well, that wasn't unusual. After all, Winston's mother was said to have slept with 200 men, so there was nothing unusual about this. But the thing was, they were not discreet. And while her husband was off in India with the Prince of Wales, as a matter of fact, she just eloped with Lord Randolph's brother, and they were living together openly. And she wrote her husband, this is even more indiscreet, saying, I'm leaving you, I love this man too much. So her husband came back immediately, took the children away, and was just going to turn her out on the street. Well, then it got more complicated, because the brother of the seduced woman told the Marquis of Blandford he wanted a duel. Well, the Marquis didn't want a duel, so the brother said, I'm just going to shoot you down in the street. Well, it was really getting out of hand, you know, and so Lord Randolph decided he should take matters under control. And what did he do? He went to the Princess of Wales, and he said, I have these letters showing that your husband sleeps with her as well. Now, I want you to put a stop to all of this harassment. That's the most extraordinary thing in the world. Of course, Queen Victoria was told about it, and it was a public scandal, which you could not have. Well, the shrewd, many times Prime Minister Disraeli came up with a solution. Let the Duke of Marlborough go off as Lord Lieutenant of Ireland. Let Lord Randolph go with him as his private secretary. Get the whole family out of England for a while, and it will come to a rest. And so it would be that Winston's first memories were really of Ireland, and living there in the palace of the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, his grandfather, and of his nurse, Mrs. Everest. She was never married. Mrs. was just a courtesy title, but she loved him. She took care of him. These were not soccer moms in those days. Lady Randolph was not a soccer mom. She didn't take Winston to, choir practice and baseball and things of this sort. She rarely saw him. She might see him once a day if she were at home. He would be brought in all cleaned and diapered by the nanny, by the lady Winston always called Womb. That is what he called Mrs. Everest. And she would show him to the mother. The mother would pat him and send him back to bed. His father would almost never see him. But Womb took care of him. And Winston described that perhaps his earliest memory was riding on a donkey with Womb, and they saw these soldiers. And his nanny were convinced that these were Irish terrorists. And she shrieked. The donkey threw him off. I got a concussion, Winston said, and that was my introduction to Irish politics. But then something even gloomier came upon the horizon, a governess. And so I began my bout with education, Winston wrote. Oh, if you put letters together, they made words, and reading wasn't that bad. But then came figures, mathematics, strange things. Why, these figures were always getting in debt with one another, and they borrowed from one another, and then they had to be paid back in some fashion. I never really mastered mathematics, he said. Once, I saw as into an abyss with clarity the whole of mathematics. But it was after dinner, and I let it go and never recaptured it. But he began his schooling. The family came back to Ireland. They came back from Ireland, and all was pretty much forgiven. Lord Randolph began again his parliamentary career and made himself quite a name. In fact, it seemed only a matter of time before he became prime minister. And when the Conservative Party was returned to power in 1885, Lord Randolph was made Chancellor of the Exchequer. At a very early age for this powerful post, a post which was generally regarded as the stepping stone to being prime minister, to be in charge of the Treasury, in other words, like our Secretary of Treasury, above all with charge for preparing the budget. And Lord Randolph set out to put himself in opposition to the prime minister, Lord Salisbury, taking positions opposite that of the prime minister, opposite of his boss, in other words, on almost every possible issue. And drawing around him a growingly strong group of fellow conservative members, and clearly planning a coup to overthrow Lord Salisbury. Well, in December 1886, it came to a head over the issue of budget. Lord Randolph demanded that his budget be accepted as it was, which entailed considerable cuts in the military budget. Lord Salisbury said, no, that is not the budget that we want. That is not our policy. These cuts are inappropriate. And so Lord Randolph said, here, you have my resignation. Again, the same kind of impetuosity that led him to go to the Princess of Wales. He thought he was indispensable. He was not. Lord Salisbury said, I accept it with delight. And then Churchill thought that all of his friends in Parliament would flock to his side, but no, they were, as he said, rats leaving a sinking ship. And there he was. removed from the exchequer. When Lord Salisbury was asked, aren't you going to bring Lord Randolph back in some position? He said, have you ever heard of somebody with a boil on their neck who wanted it back? And sure enough, Lord Randolph's power began to decline rapidly. And with it, his physical health. And the standard view still today is that he suffered from syphilis, that he had caught as a young man, and that grew rapidly worse, what his doctors diagnosed as a general paralysis. And this is what Mrs. Churchill was told, or Lady Randolph was told, Winston's mother, that she should avoid contact with her husband in that fashion. But in the meantime, there was Winston to raise. At the age of 7, he had been sent off to boarding school. Now, he adored his father and worshipped his mother. She was like the evening star, he said, for me, and she was a beautiful woman. Dark-haired, piercing eyes, a beautiful figure. But he saw little of them. And at the age of 7, he was sent to his first boarding school, St. George's. Very fine boarding school, supposed to prepare you for Eton College, the best private school in England, what the British call a public school. And he describes that first encounter with public school education. The headmaster came in and put a greenish-brown book into my hand and opened it. He said, here, this is the first declension of the Latin noun mensa. I will come back in 30 minutes to see if you have learned it. Well, he came back in 30 minutes, and I said, mensa, 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 mensam, mensai, mensai. He said, wonderful, boy, you shall do just fine. Sir? Yes? There are 3 words that say mensa. Yes. Well, why? Why are there 3 mensas? Well, this mensa is table. I see. And this mensa, it is O table. Sir? O table. Why would I say O table, sir? For I was genuinely curious, Winston wrote later. O table, you use it in addressing a chair. It is an invocation. If you are speaking to a table, it is what you use. But, sir, I almost never do. In fact, I never have. You are being impudent. Well, do that again, and you will be beaten, and beaten most severely. Oh. Well, he said, that was my introduction to the classics, from which I understand so many of our most famous men have gained so much pleasure and profit. And he was not good at school, there's no question about it. Lady Randolph, in the midst of her busy social calendar, had to constantly read these reports from the headmaster. Winston is the worst in his class. He is slovenly. He is greedy at the table. He eats too much, and his manners are terrible. He seems unable to learn anything. And he was a naughty boy, a troublesome boy, and he was punished severely. He said the standard of punishment there at St. George's would not have been permitted, this 30 years later, in any of our reformatories of today. You were dragged into a room off the library and beaten until the blood came out. And 2 years after being treated in such a way, while he was home on a vacation, and Womb saw the whelps, the beatings on his back. And she told Lady Randolph, and he was taken out of that school. And put in, he said, into a much kinder school in Brighton, the seaside resort, run by 2 ladies. And they were not nearly so brutal. And they let him learn some things he thought were kind of interesting, like history, French. Oh, there was still that terrible thing, Latin. And they were even talking about Greek. But he would later proudly say, no one ever made me write a Latin verse, and I never learned Greek beyond the alphabet. And there were still the reports that he just wasn't any good at school. He just didn't pay attention. He didn't do his reports. And more than that, he was lonely. He made no friends in school. His mother would almost never come to visit him. She forgot his Christmas presents. His father was never quite sure how old he was. And Lord Randolph came to Brighton, this time when Winston was around 11, and gave a speech. And Winston writes his father and said, Papa, why didn't you come to see me? You were just across the street from our school. Then he wrote, "Papa, I see that you're giving another speech in Brighton. May I come?" No answer. No visit. "Papa, I see that you could catch this later train and just come see me." No answer. No visit. Once his father said, after he had shouted to Winston, Winston had been making a lot of noise when the father was at home on one of Winston's vacations, he shouted at him. And seeing how upset Winston was, his father said, "You must forgive me, boy. Older people have much on their mind, and sometimes they're not as thoughtful as they should be." That was the only moment of intimacy I ever had with my father. And then, off to Harrow. Eton was the great public school. It was where his father had gone to public school. It was the preparatory for the Christ Church College at Oxford. But his father wouldn't let him go to Eton. "You're just embarrassing me there. You're such a stupid boy." And so he was sent to Harrow, a good public school, but not Eton. Thought to be in a more healthy part of England, though, and there he began another bout with education. The headmaster tried to be kind to him, took him under his wing, even gave him special tutoring in Latin. But it went nowhere. Just could not learn Latin, didn't want to learn Latin. Was supposed to be better in French, but what he really liked was English. And he remembered fondly his master in English, Mr. Somerville. Now, he said he would take apart for us an English sentence. He would use different colors of ink to show what was the noun and the verb and the adjectives. And he got into our fiber the structure of an English sentence. Now, that is a noble thing. Let boys learn Latin if they want to. Let them even learn Greek. But I would never flog a boy for not knowing Latin or Greek. But I would flog him, and flog him hard, for not knowing English. That it is his language. And I often noted that those of my contemporaries who had been so well versed in Greek and Latin perhaps had less success than I did writing their own tongue, English. He liked history, and his father was notified by the mother in one of the letters that Winston seems to be doing better in history. He is still doing bad in almost everything. In fact, he is so irregular that he is almost regular in his irregularity. He is late for everything. And of course, the most depressing thing of all was when there was Parents' Day. His parents, of course, never came, but other boys' parents were there, and they always marched out in their academic order. The best student in the class going out first. And here was Winston, always last. And the people would almost invariably say, "Look, Randolph's boy is the last of all, isn't he?" Because Randolph had so many enemies, and there was little Winston trudging out there in his top hat, last of all. But Lord Randolph heard that he was doing a little better in history. So he came in one day when Winston was there on vacation and said, "Tell me what the Grand Remonstrance was." Insignificant fact about the reign of King Charles. And Winston said, "The Grand Remonstrance, Papa?" "Yes. They tell me you're a history scholar." Parliament took away the king's power and cut off his head." "Oh, damned impudent little idiot." "But, Papa, that seems to me the grandest remonstrance of all." Then, one day his father came in. Winston was home on vacation again. And Winston had these toy soldiers, 1,500 of them. And they were laid out in magnificent array. And his father came in and studied them for about 20 minutes. And then said, "Boy, would you like to be a soldier?" "Yes, Papa, I'd like to be a soldier." And so he was removed from the academic class, what we might call the college preparatory track, and put into the army class, which was for all the dolts in the school. And so he didn't have to learn any more Greek, no more Latin, and he did a little better. Did a little better, and he said, with that one snap decision by my father, my career seemed to have been set. But I used to, for years, think that he had seen in me some military genius. I later heard he simply thought I was too stupid to become a lawyer and thought I could only be a soldier. And so he plodded on through Harrow, finally graduated at almost the very bottom of the class, and took his entrance examinations to Sandhurst. the great military college, and failed. Well, his father was upset, but said, all right, you'll try again. But he failed again. And his father said, I have had it. I am putting that boy into the business world. I am going to make a stockbroker out of him. And one of the father's friends said, I know of this tutor who tutors boys just for getting them into Sandhurst. Why don't you give Winston one more chance? And so he had this tutor. And the tutor kept writing the father and said, I do not wish you to be under false assumptions. I do not see how he can pass. I have never had a harder charge in my life. I do not think he is stupid. In fact, at times he gives me a sense of being truly bright. But his absolute lack of discipline, his irregularity, his desire to learn only the things that he wants to learn is, I think, an insurmountable barrier. But he took the exam and got in. And he wrote his father this most joyful letter, how proud he was. And he got back this letter, you are a constant disappointment to me. There are various ways of passing an examination, and you choose always the worst. Your performance is so slovenly that I have learned that you will not be allowed into the infantry class. You must be in the cavalry class. And now, in addition to everything else, I must pay for a horse while you are there. Let me tell you something. Not only are you a complete failure, you are the worst sort of failure because you have these enormous pretenses about your ability. I see nothing ahead of you but failure. You will be a wastrel of the kind that decorates the fringes of society. Do not write me anymore. I do not wish to hear anything more from you. But Sandhurst was different than Harrow. You got to learn things that were interesting. Churchill, like John Dewey, thought perhaps you should teach little children by getting them interested in things. Not forcing them to learn Latin, but letting them study things that interest them and then go on to something else and ever deeper into a subject. And he said, there at Sandhurst, we studied things that had an immediate value. We studied tactics and fortifications. We studied topography. We studied military law and military administration, all of which I was going to be using very soon. And the course only lasted 18 months. So you progressed rapidly. And you had a great deal of free time. I was frequently invited to the officers' mess at fine regiments and saw what it was to be a soldier. And so I progressed. And in fact, in a class of 130, he graduated 20th. So he could do the work. It's just that no one had bothered to interest him. In the meantime, his father's health declined ever more rapidly. His speeches in Parliament were pathetic to hear. He could no longer keep the thread of his ideas going. He started off on a trip around the world, and shortly before he left, he wrote another searing letter to Winston. I just went to my watchmaker's to have my watch oiled before I leave. He showed me the watch that I gave you when you did well that first term at Sandhurst. It's a beautiful watch. It is rusted, and he says it will have to be completely taken apart. I will never give you anything else. Churchill wrote back, but Papa, you don't understand. We don't have a real pocket, and it popped out of my little slit the way I carry it, and it fell into a stream. And I dove down into the stream, and I couldn't find it. So I got permission to take some soldiers that are there on the base, and we dammed up the stream and diverted it and made it dry, and I got it out. And I just didn't want to make you mad by telling you about it, but I'll pay for it. But when the watch was repaired, Lord Randolph gave it to Churchill's younger brother, who kept it for the rest of his life. Lord Randolph could not complete the trip around the world. He had to be brought back in a straitjacket and died in lingering pain and agony the same year that Churchill would pass out of Sandhurst. Churchill wrote that the solitary tree, if it grows at all, grows to be strong and sturdy. And frequently a boy deprived of a father's love, feels determined to win back that love even after the father has gone. And Churchill would spend a part of his life trying to live up to the expectations of the father who denied him that love. The years from 20 to 25, Churchill said, that's the greatest time of life. And to that time in Churchill's life, we will turn in our next lecture.